Steam rose from the wok as I tossed the noodles with practiced precision, the familiar rhythm of metal striking metal blending seamlessly with the lively sounds of my kitchen. The Golden Dragon had been in my family for 3 generations, its heartbeat as steady and familiar to me as my own. Then came the voice that cut through the kitchen noise like a dull knife. I hope you're finally ready to discuss a reasonable offer for this establishment. Richard Maxwell stood in the doorway, an expensive suit draped over his broad frame, looking entirely out of place amidst the worn kitchen equipment and fragrant steam. Behind him, his latest development partner shifted uncomfortably, likely wondering why a man of Maxwell's stature was wasting his time in a small Chinese restaurant in what they called a transitional neighborhood. "Good evening, Richard," I replied, keeping my focus on the wok. "The usual order? Your wife loves our Kung Pao chicken." "This isn't about dinner," he snapped. His eyes swept the kitchen with thinly veiled disdain. "Look around you, Daniel. This neighborhood is dying. These old buildings, these family businesses, they're relics. The future is high-end retail, luxury developments. Be smart for once in your life." I carefully plated the noodles, drizzling a precise spiral of sauce before passing the dish to Ming, my head server. "The neighborhood isn't dying, Richard," I said evenly. "It's evolving. Is that what you call it?" He scoffed, gesturing toward the kitchen. "This equipment is older than you are. The building needs repairs. Even with Sarah's trust fund supplementing your income, you're barely keeping this place afloat." There it was, the trust fund comment. Richard never missed an opportunity to remind me that his daughter's inheritance was, in his mind, the only thing preventing my business from crumbling. What he didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Sarah's trust fund had never been touched. Every repair, every upgrade, every strategic purchase had come from my own careful planning. "I appreciate your concern," I said, setting another order into the wok, the flames flaring up as I moved the ingredients with deliberate grace. "But the Golden Dragon isn't for sale." His development partner stepped forward, offering a polished smile, his designer watch glinting under the kitchen lights. "Mr. Chen, perhaps we could discuss numbers. Maxwell Development is prepared to make a very generous offer." I studied him for a moment, another real estate speculator who saw our neighborhood as nothing more than profit margins on a spreadsheet. "The Golden Dragon has been here for 60 years, I said, my voice calm but firm. "My grandfather started with nothing but a wok and a dream. He built this place into the heart of the community. Some things are worth more than money." Richard's expression darkened. "This isn't about your family legacy, Daniel. It's about progress. Our new development will transform this entire block. Luxury hotels, upscale shopping, premium condos. Do you really want to be the only holdout? The only thing standing between this neighborhood and a real future?" I thought of the thick folder in my office, the carefully organized property deeds, the network of shell companies I had set up over the past 5 years. "How is the development coming along?" I asked, my tone mild. "I heard there were some issues with property acquisition." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Minor setbacks. Once people see the project's potential, they'll be lining up to sell." "If you say so." I turned back to my cooking. "Now, unless you're staying for dinner, I have orders to prepare." After they left, Sarah emerged from the office upstairs, her arms wrapping around my waist as she rested her head against my back. "Still not going to tell him?" she murmured. I kissed her forehead. "Not yet. The timing isn't right." She laughed softly. "You and your timing. Sometimes I think you missed your calling as a chess player." "Chess is too rigid," I replied. "Real estate is more like cooking. It's about feeling the moment, knowing exactly when to turn off the heat." And the heat was definitely rising. Richard's development project was racing against time. Investors were expecting construction to begin in 3 months, permits were ready to be filed, but they were missing one crucial ingredient. They didn't own enough property to build what they had promised. What Richard didn't know was that his minor setbacks weren't accidents. Over the past 5 years, I had been quietly acquiring buildings throughout the neighborhood through various shell companies. Not just any buildings, key properties, ones essential for any large-scale development. The idea had taken root shortly after I took over the Golden Dragon from my father. I had noticed developers circling, scooping up properties from aging owners at bargain prices. I saw the pattern forming, the same one that had erased other historic neighborhoods in the city. So I adapted. The restaurant's steady profits secured small business loans. Shell companies were created, each with legitimate portfolios, hiding my acquisitions from the prying eyes of speculators. Slowly, methodically, I built a network of properties that formed an invisible stronghold. The Golden Dragon wasn't just a restaurant. It was my watchtower, giving me a perfect view of every real estate move in the area. Later that night, after closing, I was reviewing recent property transfers when Ming knocked on my office door. "Mr. Chen, there's someone here to see you." Mrs. Liu, the owner of the corner grocery store, stepped in. In her 70s, she had run her shop for nearly 4 decades. Her expression was troubled. "They came to see me today," she said in Mandarin. "The developers offered me 3 times what my store is worth." "Let me guess," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "Maxwell Development?" She nodded, wringing her hands. "They say I must sell quickly. That everyone else is selling. My children think it's too much money to refuse." I met her gaze. "Do you want to sell?" Tears filled her eyes. "This store was my American dream. My husband and I came here with nothing, built this life one day at a time. But maybe they're right. Maybe it's time to let go." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a file. What if there was another option? An hour later, Mrs. Liu left my office with a renewed sense of purpose. Another piece had fallen into place. The next morning, Richard's development team received unexpected news. Mrs. Liu's grocery store had been sold, but not to them. The buyer was a small holding company they had never heard of. In his downtown office, Richard Maxwell was about to learn that his setbacks were not coincidences. They were part of a much larger pattern, one that had been forming as quietly and steadily as steam rising from a well-tended wok. The crisis meeting at Maxwell Development was in full swing when Sarah texted me. "Dad's face is getting red by the minute. Board wants to know why they can't secure the properties they need." I smiled, turning back to my lunch prep. The timing was perfect, like knowing exactly when to add the final ingredient to a complex dish. Over the past week, Richard's team had discovered that the key properties they needed were owned by a web of seemingly unrelated companies: Summit Holdings, Eastern Star Investments, River City Properties, and more. Every single one had politely but firmly declined to sell. What they hadn't figured out yet was that every company traced back to me. Richard stormed into my kitchen, this time with an entourage: lawyers, development partners, and a very stressed-looking project manager. "What do you know about these property companies?" I sliced green onions, each cut precise and deliberate. "Good afternoon, Richard. Quite a crowd for lunch. Should I set up the private dining room?" "Stop playing games," he snapped. "Sarah says you know everything that happens in this neighborhood. These companies keep blocking our development. What do you know about them?" I finally looked up and smiled. "Why don't you stay for dinner, Richard? We have a lot to talk about." I set down my knife, wiped my hands on my apron, and nodded toward the door. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation upstairs." Ming, my head chef, stepped in seamlessly as I left the kitchen, already taking over lunch prep with practiced efficiency. Upstairs in my office, Richard paced like a caged animal while his team spread documents across my desk. Their project manager, Adam Torres, jabbed a finger at the large neighborhood map they had unrolled before me. "We've secured about 60% of the properties we need," he explained. "But these key parcels, the corner lots, the larger buildings, they're all owned by different investment companies. Without them, the project isn't viable." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers as I studied the map. Every red-marked building, every stubborn holdout they couldn't acquire, represented years of careful planning. Relationships nurtured, properties acquired, deals made in hushed conversations over shared meals. Richard slammed his hands on my desk, rattling the ceramic tea cup at its edge. "Enough of this, Daniel. You know everyone in this neighborhood. You must know who's behind these companies. Give us their contact information, and we'll make it worth your while." His voice was sharp, commanding, as if money alone could force my hand. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it in front of him. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and deliberate, "I do know who owns those properties." Richard's eyes lit up with greedy anticipation. His lawyer reached for the folder, but I held up a hand, stopping them. "Before you open that, let me ask you something," I said. "Did you ever wonder why I never touched Sarah's trust fund? Why I kept running what you so often called a failing restaurant, instead of cashing out when I had the chance?" Richard frowned, his impatience barely contained. "Because you're stubborn. Because you don't see the bigger picture." I shook my head slowly. "No, because I saw a picture bigger than your luxury hotels and high-end boutiques. I saw a neighborhood worth protecting." I pushed the folder toward him, watching as he flipped open the first document. The change in his expression was almost comical. The confusion, the disbelief, the slow, dawning horror. "This," he stuttered, his voice hoarse. "This is impossible." But the ink on those deeds was real, the company registrations undeniable. "Summit Holdings LC is registered to you?" he whispered. I nodded, as is Eastern Star Investments, River City Properties, and every other firm holding those key properties you so desperately need. The room erupted into chaos. Lawyers scrambled through documents, muttering in disbelief. Adam Torres stared at his now useless map, shaking his head. And Richard looked like he might explode. "You," he choked. "You've been blocking our development?" "No," I corrected. "I've been protecting this neighborhood." His hands clenched into fists. "Do you have any idea how much money you've cost us?" I met his furious gaze without flinching. "Less than you've cost neighborhoods like ours over the years. How many family businesses have you forced out? How many communities have you torn apart, replacing them with glass towers and soulless storefronts?" A voice came from the doorway. "Dad, sit down before you have a stroke." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, an amused glint in her eyes. "You knew about this?" Richard turned to her, his face ashen. "Of course I knew," she said. "I helped." His breath caught. Did you really think I spent all those years in corporate law just to be the developer's daughter?" she asked, arching a brow. Richard collapsed into a chair, shaking his head. "But why? Why go through all this trouble?" I walked to the window, gazing down at the streets below. At Mrs. Lou's Corner Grocery, where generations of immigrants had stocked their first kitchens. At the Guerra family bakery, where the scent of fresh bread had paid for 3 children's college degrees. At the Golden Dragon, my grandfather's legacy, still standing strong after 60 years. "Because this isn't just real estate," I said quietly. "It's people, stories, dreams." I turned back to Richard. "My grandfather built this restaurant when banks wouldn't lend to Chinese immigrants. Mrs. Lou's store helped families get their start. The businesses here aren't relics, they're foundations. I spent the last 5 years buying every key property, not to hoard them, but to protect them." Adam Torres, still staring at the documents, spoke up hesitantly. "These properties, they're worth at least 5 times what you paid for them." He swallowed. "Probably more." I nodded. "But they're not for sale." Richard's voice was tight with frustration. "Then what's your plan? Sit on them forever?" "Not forever," I said, pulling out another document. "I'm transferring all of them to the Golden Dragon Community Trust." Silence. Sarah stepped forward, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "The trust will ensure long-term, affordable leases for local businesses," she explained. "Profits will fund small business loans for new entrepreneurs. Ironclad, Dad. Legally untouchable." Richard stared at us for a long moment. For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. Not quite understanding, but perhaps the first glimmer of respect. "You outmaneuvered me," he said at last, almost grudgingly. "All these years, I thought you were just a stubborn chef who got lucky with my daughter. But you were playing a completely different game." I smiled. "Not a game," I corrected. "A legacy." His lawyers packed up their documents. The project manager rolled up his useless map. One by one, they filed out of my office. Richard was the last to leave. He hesitated at the door, then sighed. "That Kung Pao chicken," he muttered. "Catherine really does love it." I chuckled. "Tell her it's on the house. Family discount." That evening, the restaurant was packed as usual. Mrs. Lou dropped by with fresh vegetables. The Guerra kids helped clear tables between their homework. Ming's daughter sat in a back booth, polishing her college application essay. I stood at my station, the rhythm of woks and cleavers filling the air, the scent of garlic and sesame rising like steam from a well-worn pan. A week later, Maxwell Development announced their project was relocating. Investors were angry, but they found another neighborhood to gentrify. Not this one. Not mine. A month later, a young couple came to see me. They wanted to open a Vietnamese faux shop in one of the trust's properties. As they spoke, hopeful, nervous, determined, I saw my grandfather in them. I saw the same hunger, not just for success, but for something lasting. "The rent is fair," I told them. "The lease is secure. All you need is good food and hard work." They signed the papers that afternoon. Another dream taking root. Sarah teases me sometimes about my long game. About how I spent 5 years building a quiet real estate empire just to keep things the same. But she understands. Some things are worth preserving. And now, when developers come sniffing around, the local business owners just smile and direct them to the Golden Dragon Community Trust's legal office, where my brilliant wife explains, in perfect legal terms, why this particular American dream isn't for sale. And in my kitchen, I keep cooking, watching over my neighborhood, like my grandfather once did, because the best recipes, the ones that truly last, can't be rushed. They need time, patience, and most importantly, a place to call home.